Hi, I'm Shannon Martin from Podbean, and I'm here today to talk about monetizing your podcast. In other words, getting paid to podcast. And today will be part one. We'll talk generally about monetization and strategies, but we will also get a little more into depth about crowdfunding or patron programs. And in part two, we'll get more into depth about advertising. So let's get started. Before you consider monetizing, you want to ask yourself, of course, do you want to monetize? But assuming you're listening to this because you have an interest, we'll go with that assumption. And of course, it also is about timing. So are you ready to monetize? And a lot of people ask, when's the right time? When should I ask my audience to support me or seek out advertisers? This is a very personalized question, and there is no one answer. I have seen podcasters who get started with the idea of monetizing before they even create their show and even have sponsors lined up before they have their first download. Most commonly, however, I think that people want to focus first on the quality of their content and building their audience. Those are the key foundations to being prepared to monetize. So those are the things that you want to have lined up. In the cases where people had it prepared beforehand and even had sponsors, often they were experienced with podcasting before, or they had an online persona or community and relationships with those potential sponsors in a specific niche. So that is possible, but it's not the most common situation. So I think more commonly you'll find that people look to make money from their show once they've gotten a solid foundation. And we'll talk a little bit more about what advertisers are looking for in that a bit later as well. Then, of course, your goals and priorities are very important in this. So you may have some concerns, and those concerns may be justified. You may worry that you're going to alienate an audience by asking for donations or by adding advertising to your show, or that you're going to distract yourself from the work that it takes. Those are important things to consider. It's important to consider the risks and the benefits. So will you make enough money from doing these monetization strategies to make it worth the extra time that you need to put in? And we'll talk about that more, as well as some of the resources that can help you to make it simpler, because it can be very complex and it can be very simple with some of the tools and platforms that are out there. So, what are the ways to monetize a podcast? There are some primary ways. The most commonly known probably is thinking about advertising, and we will get into that in part two. The second one, which we'll go into more depth about today, is listener support. This is also often known as patron programs, crowdfunding, or listener donations. So this is where your listeners support you voluntarily. The third one is also listener support, but it's where you sell content, premium content. This might mean you sell a subscription or you sell individual episodes. So this is often used for people who provide a lot of educational value in their content, or they provide a basic show and then they get into more depth with bonus content or things that are almost akin to courses. Selling products is another common way to monetize a show. This can be anything from show swag, like t-shirts and hats and mugs, to selling digital products like online courses, ebooks, and maybe access to a private group or coaching type session. So there's all kinds of products that can be sold. Similarly, indirect monetization kind of dovetails with that. And indirect monetization means you may not make money directly from your podcast, but it does lead to income. So often this is used for people that are marketing services and the company that they own or what they do for a living by their expertise on their podcast, or they're building influence, connecting with people through their podcast, which enables them to get hired as a speaker or a coach, or to get work in their chosen field. So those are some of the indirect ways. I think that's often underestimated as something that's more commonly done out there, and something that a lot of people may want to consider, even when considering creating a podcast and what's the benefit. Okay, we'll get a little bit more into the crowdfunding aspect here, and also called listener support, and also known as patron programs. And I'll share a little bit of information from our Podbean patron program shortly. And this is, crowdfunding seems to be a hot new buzzword. People hear about Kickstarter and Indiegogo and similar platforms where people raise money, typically to launch a product and sometimes to provide a service. But it's not anything new. There's been patrons of the arts for many years that have supported artists' great work. And NPR is a great example of an audio creation, audio creators that are supported primarily by listeners. So it's not something uncommon, and it's something that kind of has a long history. So some of the most common questions we get about this, or some of the reactions I typically hear, are things like, why would someone pay me for something when they can get it for free? And people also feel uncomfortable asking for donations. And that's why I remind people frequently that the NPR model, that this mirrors that, because a lot of people are quite used to that model, and when they have that comparison, they understand a little more. So I think if you feel comfortable about what you're creating and what you're providing to the audience, it may be something worth considering. So when you're thinking about setting up ability for listeners to support you, there's a couple of different ways to do it. A lot of people have the ability for someone to give a one-time donation. I've heard from several podcasters who actually had listeners reach out and say they wanted to support the work, and sometimes even sent a PayPal donation over, knowing the person's email address without even having that set up. So you can set up simple buttons on your site for PayPal donations or other means of getting donations. You can also use third-party processors. There's a lot of plugins and services out there. Here are a few mentioned on this page. So that's one thing you can do. More typically with podcasting, people are looking at ongoing support, because podcasting's very nature is that it's an ongoing project. So podcasters can look at crowdfunding platforms. There are many out there that are well known, like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, GoFundMe. Those are geared more towards one-time projects or products, typically. So you work up to a certain date of asking for support, and then the product or the project launches. With other crowdfunding platforms that have been created for creators specifically, such as Patreon and Podbean's podcast crowdfunding platform, these are focused on the ability for people to support you on an ongoing basis. So it can be set up a couple of different ways on Patreon, and I will get into a little more detail of how we've set it up with Podbean. So you can see the address there, patron.podbean.com. It is available for any podcaster, no matter where you're hosted. You simply submit your RSS feed and create your page there. And it's very integrated with your podcast, and we'll share a little more about that in a minute. It is centered around monthly donations, so supporting your continued work on a monthly basis. People say, I want to donate $1 or $5 or whatever, and then they're charged that on a monthly basis. So to get a little bit into how to set up a successful patron program for a podcaster, you hear a lot of talk about the rewards. And these are the things that people will get for being a supporter at a certain level. I will share that the most popular levels are often the lower levels. There's a lot of listeners who are willing to support you. They enjoy the work you're doing, and for $1, $2, or $3 per month, it's something they can afford, and they feel it's worth at least that. For those types of levels, usually don't really give much in terms of rewards. Typically, what we see is someone just says, "Hey, if you give us $1, we're very thankful, and here's what we're going to continue to create." Or we might list you in the show or in the show notes or on our website. So there's different options like that. As you get to higher levels, you typically want to provide something more robust, more direct. And I always think of it from the perspective that most of your listeners want more of you. They want more of your subject, your show, your community. They want to be part of it. That's the kind of thing they're looking for. They may also be interested in rewards that relate to your topic, and There may be products and things for your show like that, but a lot of what they really are looking for is more access to you and your show. So you can get very creative with this. I also, a couple words of warning. One is that when you offer to thank listeners, say on your show or to list them somewhere, just be cautious of that. For instance, if you're going to read their names in the show, just realize that if you do get so lucky as to get hundreds of patrons at that level, that's potentially going to be a problem to do that during your show. So think through this a little bit as you're setting it up. And similarly with some of the higher level rewards, if you're going to offer extra content or to do subjects of shows specifically on what a patron wants, or to do something special like that, it is going to take you a certain amount of work. So you have to determine if that makes sense at that level. So here's some examples of some of the rewards of some of our Podbean patron program podcasters. And you can see that a lot of what I talked about is what they do. So they talk about, one of the shows offers for a $25 per month donation that the person can pick an item for them to review on the show. And this, I believe, is maybe a gaming show or a technology show. So it's a great fit. Again, it's that more access rewards in that way. There's also a $5 pledge up there that shows where the person gets bonus content. And then there's a $20 example where they can be a guest on the podcast. Those are all things that are great. Other things you can do are digital type of rewards, virtual rewards. So access to a special newsletter, a special Facebook group, a Google Hangout with the show hosts once a month. All of those kind of things. So if your listeners enjoy the type of content you provide, they enjoy you, they often feel a very, very much an affinity towards you, these are the kind of things that they may donate a little more to have access to. But don't forget that a lot of them are just glad to support your show because they appreciate what you're doing, and so those lower levels can be important. So it varies quite widely what we see from those that have been successful with it. We've had one podcaster who's quite successful with a higher level donation, and he has a book that's quite sought after that he gives for that. So show swag and actual products can also be something you give out, but remember that will require you to do some fulfillment of those things. Because Podbean offers a premium option for those that are hosted with us, they can tie in offering bonus content and that kind of thing with their patron program. So that's one option. And I believe Patreon also offers a private RSS feed for the same type of thing. So when you're doing a crowdfunding campaign, you want to have a great, compelling story. In your case, a lot of your listeners are going to understand what your podcast is about, but you want to emphasize to them what your goals are in asking for support and what you're hoping to continue to do. A video is always very compelling in crowdfunding. People like to just see and hear from you. It doesn't have to be perfectly produced, but just an honest discussion of kind of why you've started this, and it personalizes things. And of course, the number one thing with this is going to be promotion and getting the word out there, and of course, mentioning it in your show. Don't have to be obnoxious about it, but if you have this, you have to mention that you have it so that your listeners can know. One thing we've done with our Podbean platform is to have an integrated button right in our app when they're listening to your show, as well as on your site. And if you're not hosted with us, you can add a button to your site easily. But if someone does listen in our app, it makes it super simple. I talked a little bit about management. Communication is also important, of course, thanking your sponsors. We offer a comment section that's specific just to patron supporters with the Podbean tool. So just remember, listeners often feel more engaged when they become supporters. You'll be surprised that they'll often say things like, I was feeling guilty before when I wasn't giving to your show. I've always wanted to donate because I thought you did great work, and a lot of these kind of things. So when you're worried about asking for money, those are some important things to consider. And if you go to patron.podbean.com, you can look at some of our successful campaigns and look at some of the rewards they're offering, their goals, and some of the successes that they've had to give you some ideas of how that can work for you. We'll talk next time a little more about advertising and some more details.